we're going, oh, there's a recording in progress notification, sorry. We can see that this is all leading to a kind of a crisis, that it will become a self-fulfilling prophecy if we cannot figure out how to engage with mental health and climate. It's been very well documented. There's a lot of research on climate change's effects on mental health. And I won't read through all of these. You can sort of multitask and read through these if you care to take a picture of it or whatever. But this is all, there's scientific evidence for all of these things. Extreme weather events are going to cause trauma and displacement. Air pollution actually increases psychiatric illness, not just physical problems. Heat leading to suicide, all kinds of things. So there is a clear sense of a growing, mounting awareness of this. And just to give you a sense of, yeah, I can feel it in my students. It's not even just the physical aspects of climate change affecting mental health. It is the fear of impending doom, just in and of itself, that gives them a whole set of mental health questions to be thinking about. I'm hoping this seems familiar to you and you feel a little bit validated and seen when you think about the ways that my students feel. If you're feeling any of these things, and maybe we can talk about it afterwards. No, I don't feel that, Sarah, or whatever. But this idea that there's no good that people can do for the planet. Only all of my students' ideas about what humans can do to the environment is framed as impact, and that's always negative impact. And this is exacerbated by activities, for example, like the ecological footprint exercise, which I don't know if any of you all have done, but this notion that your individual actions all add up to this impact, and that's bad stuff. And so you need to reduce all of that. Well, it gets to the point where the logical conclusion of that is to actually erase yourself entirely, right? Because there's no good you can offer. And of course, we discovered years later that the ecological footprint exercise was created by BP as a way to deflect attention away from corporate pollution and really frame the climate problem as a problem of individual people. So this is something we can talk about later too. Similarly, Karen Litfin calls this thing the misanthropic temptation, that all of humanity really sucks. And so it's just the easy low-hanging fruit thing to say when you're teaching climate or teaching ecological restoration or teaching in a lot of the environmental sciences, especially, that humanity has done this stuff. In fact, if you want to get a National Science Foundation grant, which is the NSF, is like the biggest amount of money you can get for studying climate stuff as a professor. The only way you can get an NSF grant as a non-scientist is if you're measuring human impact. So even in the sciences, the only way is that humans come into the picture is in this kind of all of humanity sucks framework. The problems are too big and interconnected, and people are too small and powerless to fix them. In my book, I call this the apathy trap, but other people are theorizing this in lots of different ways. And I think this really sets us up for a really good opportunity for us to think about the framing of the problem is actually the problem, right? So if the problem is being framed as too big and we are being framed as too small, that leaves us feeling apathetic. But the solution is not to just get more power or to reduce the size of the problem, although those things are wonderful too. But also part of the solution is to reframe this. And so I'm teasing you with that idea, and we'll get more to that a little bit later. This inevitability trope, I call it, that we're past this point of no return. And once you participate in the inevitability trope, that this is inevitable and there's nothing we can do about it, you certainly sign people up for apathy, right? And of course, based on Frederick Jameson's work, and lots of people have said this in lots of different ways, I've seen this quote sort of said in lots of different ways, it's that most Americans think it's easier to imagine an apocalypse than a post-fossil fuel society. Yet we know that a post-fossil fuel society is actually probably more likely and possible, but the lack of the radical imagination of what's possible is at the core of where are we going to put our next feet, right? Next steps. My students feel like their life course is unclear and it won't be like previous generations. So that throws absolutely everything out the window, especially the notion of bringing children into this world. So this is a really unique moment. I think environmentalists of older generations think, oh, I didn't have children. You know, I felt the same way. I had climate anxiety too. What's different about these young people? And one of the things that's really uniquely different is that the argument that most young people use to think about not bringing children into the world this reproductive refusal moment, has to do with not thinking that the world will be habitable for their children. The 1960s and 70s environmental argument about not having children was about reducing your impact on the planet. And that's a very different argument. And I would argue that this generation's reason is deeply more existential. And I mentioned this idea of nihilism, students' inability to even show up to class, much less save the world, and also more and worse things that young people are doing. We see the mental health and the suicide rates skyrocketing in young people, and for people who aren't thinking about climate, you know, in the larger sort of political and economic structures that we're living in, and how absolutely life destructive they are, you know, it's not really a wonder why that's happening. And resentment, betrayal, and anger are often some of the emotions of young people that is the result of the selfishness, denial, and delay of previous generations. So there's a real sense of intergenerational resentment there. So young people feel and experience climate change more. There's a lot of data that shows this. And this is often something that older generations push back on me for and say, no, that's not, we felt it too, but there's some pretty astonishing data. And the things that young people are bringing to the conversation, I think, are pretty important to be thinking about, that are different. And not to mention, young people ages 16 to 25 are the largest population in America, but also in the world. And so there's a sense of this generation is going to change things, right? There's a huge amount of them. Nearly 60% of the 10,000 16 to 25-year-olds from 8 countries that were surveyed in the spring of 21 by this group of collaborators said that they felt extremely, very worried or extremely worried. More than 45% of those questioned said that feelings about the climate affected their daily lives. 3/4 of them said they thought the future was frightening, and over half say they think humanity is doomed. 1 in 4 is not going to have children because of the climate. And I'm not saying that not having children is some terrible crisis. I'm just sort of giving it to as a diagnostic of where we're at on this, right? So, you know, there's some pretty astonishing numbers here. Interestingly enough, in a US context, if you go granular on this data, US young people are mark lower on all of these questions than the sort of collective global numbers that we're looking at here. And so that raises another set of questions, right? How is it that US young people are not feeling the same about these things as the rest of the world? A different set of questions. So I just want to think about, again, going to this question of the mental health impacts of climate change. One of the things that will happen when you have acute or chronic anxiety or stress in your life, and this is regardless of whether it's related to the climate, this should feel pretty, you know, we've all had anxiety and stress in our lives, and we can feel ourselves when we move out of a place where we're feeling wise and equanimous and able to act and function in our lives. When we're in that optimal zone, we're in what some scholars and psychologists call the range of resilience. And Dan Siegel calls it the window of tolerance, the psychologist. So if we're in our window of tolerance, that green zone right there, we're able to activate our prefrontal cortex, make decisions that are thinking about the long term, not just the short term, defer gratification for larger values, all kinds of things that are associated with sort of prefrontal cortex rational thinking. But when we are hyper aroused, when we get triggered out of our range of resilience, we have all of these other kinds of things that happen. And many of you probably have felt some of these things. Can't think clearly, your body kind of shuts down, you start to feel overwhelmed, you might have flashbacks, you have increased heart rate, all these sorts of things. And hypoarousal has that effect I was mentioning earlier about the sort of numbing out, right? Like just sort of checking out, because there's not, do you feel like there's nothing you can do to control the conditions of your moment, right? So this range of resilience and this window of tolerance is actually narrower for people who've experienced a lot of chronic and acute stress, including trauma. And it is wider for people who have more sort of privilege and emotional wisdom and intelligence and have been given all kinds of security and all their needs met their whole lives, right? So you can imagine that when the band being narrower, and it's a lot easier to get triggered out of it. And this is actually some of the basic theory and psychology theory around trauma. Well, increasingly, as we know, climate anxiety about the future or climate trauma in the moment now, which many of my students are also experiencing, is going to make us operate outside of the range of resilience often, more often than it didn't. And so there's this effect on our mental health, which has, as you can imagine, you look at those things like tense and rapid breathing, reactivity, startle response. There's not a division between mental and physical health. Increasingly, polyvagal theory shows this. Wisdom traditions know this, science knows this, but the medical establishment does not apply it. That, of course, these effects on our mental health will have all kinds of knock-on effects on all of our organ systems of our body. And so there's a whole field of something called psychoneuroimmunology, and people who are studying this stuff are so interesting. Like I said, I'm totally geeking out on this stuff. I love it, but my mind is blown. How is it that people are expected to face, mitigate, address, adapt to all of the things that climate is going to do to us if all of these things are starting to shut down, right? The worry and stress about climate anxiety, much less pandemic anxiety, much less all the just normal stuff of everyday life, right? How are we supposed to transcend these things so we can act from a big range of resilience and change the systems that cause all of this destruction in the first place? That's really the goal here. So what I like to think about, instead of just thinking about the climate change's effects on our mental health, after we looked at those images, right, we start to think actually mental health and physical health might actually affect climate change. And so this chart kind of maps us a little bit. If you think about in the center, climate disruption, the orange triangle, kicking off this feedback loop of reactivity that increases our stress, which will increase structural stress because we're not going to be functioning in our systems very well, right? Jobs and schools and whatever. That's going to decrease these institutions' ability to mitigate climate change. And that will then thereby increase climate disruption, right? That makes sense, that cycle. I know it sounds almost too clean to be true, but it's just a way of illustrating that the opposite then also is true too. Climate disruption, if we tackle this right, and if we're wise about it, and we put all of our energy to it, can actually kick off, we can induce some growth. We can have decreased structural stress. We can have this as an opportunity, which I love how my students think about this as an opportunity to really reshape everything. We're in a womb and not a tomb, all this kind of stuff. Well, that can have the effect of increasing climate mitigation, which will thereby diminish climate disruption. So that's really the ideal. I mean, I know I'm pie in the sky here, but I love thinking about, it's not just about climate change's effects on our mental and physical health. It's also our mental and physical health impacts on climate change that we need to be thinking about. Because I think a lot of people think my mental health doesn't matter because all of these problems out there need my urgent attention. And so I'm going to burn the midnight oil and just, crank out in a sense of urgency and burnout, working my tail off to get, the activism done or the work done. And I see burnout and activists as a kind of violence against not just themselves, but against the stuff they care about the most. If we truly love the planet, if we truly want to do all this work to save it, then we won't let ourselves have physical and mental consequences of all of this stuff, right? I mean, to the extent that we can have control over that, understood, there's a lot of stuff here that we do not have control over. And we certainly will need our mental and physical health as shipshape as possible if we are to change and resist and rebuild structures that have caused all of this suffering in the first place, which, like I said, is the real goal. So forget the charts. Let's just listen to a 22-year-old who wrote a beautiful piece in Yes Magazine, which is my favorite pieces. She says in this, my favorite quote, it kind of gets to the same spirit of things, okay? It's not just mental health getting affected by climate change. It's my mental health is necessary to resist these systems. Depression tells us that we are at once powerless and culpable. And therefore, the only logical response is to disengage, turn inward, eschew connection, a response which only serves to reinforce the oppressive systems like racial injustice and capitalism that are truly responsible for our suffering in the first place. I mean, yes, you could not say it better. I really think that Morgan here describes that cycle, those two cycles, those feedback loops even better, right? The response to climate change is to shut down, right? But that's exactly the response which will only allow these oppressive systems to thrive even more. They're winning when we do that, right? They're winning when we do that. Beautiful. All right, so just shifting gears a little bit to thinking about, well, so, okay, Our emotions seem to be mattering. Okay, so why? Let's break it down a little bit. In your setting in college, you probably have thought about this, but emotions turn out to be more integral to learning, the learning processes, than logic. And this is maybe counterintuitive, but there's evidence about this neuroaffective science described in this fabulous book that emotions actually activate learning more than any other form of appeal. Similarly, emotions like shame, fear, love, trust dictate our actions and behavior more than data or reason-based appeals. Again, counterintuitive. Most of my students walk into classrooms saying, oh, I have to write essays with facts to get people to be persuaded about something. Well, no, it turns out emotions persuade people far more. And people who study conservation psychology have some very cool research on this, and I encourage you to check it out. The science of emotions shows that different emotions shape climate action in different ways and also among different communities. So we ought to use this information really strategically. It turns out, for example, that guilt does not activate long-term behavior change, whereas altruism is a far more effective emotion at getting people to make behavior change. It's fascinating stuff. Just as an example, our interior lives affect our ability to engage in climate work, really simply put. Right? If your cup is not full, if your tank isn't full, you are not going to be able to do the work, and you're going to feel resentful about it. You're going to feel burned out by it, right? The sort of stuff that is required to keep you coming back for more is just not there, right? And we need to be in it for the long haul, right? It's our life's work. Climate change is increasing, affecting mental health, and vice versa is also true. So why these emotions matter? Oh, and I have one more here. Yeah, definitely this one. Environmental emotions, especially things like when we think about climate anxiety, but in my first book, I talked about the emotion of disgust and how the emotion of disgust really activates the racist elements of environmentalism. Environmental emotions can lead to things like violence, ecofascism, and further harm. When you think about, for example, the shootings in Buffalo that happened fairly recently, the notion of the Great Replacement theory, the notion of in the El Paso shootings, the title of the note that the mass shooter's note was called An Inconvenient Truth, riffing off, of course, of Al Gore. The Christchurch shootings, these are all coming from people who are self-declared eco-fascists. And so this climate anxiety can just as easily trip somebody not into doing any kind of good to save life on Earth, right? But actually destroy more life. So we need to be very cognizant of how critical emotions are to the politics that we're seeing in the world. Gus Speth is kind of a famous guy. This is one of my favorite quotes, and I'm sure some of you have probably seen this quote before, and I think Dr. Meehan kind of mentioned it earlier. He has this great quote. I love it because I'm a person with a background in the humanities who studies the environment, so I have a little bit of like the science inferiority complex because science people are always expecting me to be sciencey, and I'm not. And I'm like, all right, people, Gus Speth said this, okay? I used to think that the top global environmental problems were biodiversity loss, ecosystem collapse, and climate change. I thought that with 30 years of good science, we could address these problems, but I was wrong. And then he goes on to say the top environmental problems are selfishness, greed, and apathy. And to deal with these, we need a spiritual and cultural transformation. And we scientists don't know how to do that. So just another reason to think about the role of emotions, the role of culture change, the roles of hearts and minds, right? I love this quote by Paul Hawken. The most complex radical climate technology on Earth is the human heart and mind, not a solar panel. I love that quote. Imagine what if we invested in hearts and minds as much as we invested in green tech. It's like, it blows my mind, blows my mind. That's what I'm trying to do over here. I don't know. So I wrote a book trying to do that. I think that the subtitle I wanted for my book was an existential toolkit for the climate generation, but it's in too wordy apparently. But anyway, I see that there are many, many books out there about the 10 things you can do to save the planet, or most sustainable things, or being a minimalist, or all these things. And I thought, why isn't anyone talking about the sort of mental and emotional things that we're going to need to do that you could just do sitting here all day long? You don't actually have to physically even do anything, and it will change the actual planetary crisis. I know that's a radical thought, but hear me out, okay? So these are the chapters from my book. Many of them are really going about just critiquing the dominant framework about how even the climate crisis has been framed. So not just critiquing the denialists and critiquing the corporate capitalists and critiquing the fossil fuel industry and their reality that they live in, but even being critical of the way that the climate justice movement has been doing things and thinking about things. So it's a little bit, going on the edge here. One of the ones that I want to really focus in on, and I just want to draw your attention to some of these titles: Be Less Right and More in Relation, Chapter 6. This is really about the instinct that many climate activists have around getting in fights with people, kind of calling them out and correcting them, and the sort of dopamine hits we get from being self-righteous and knowing more, and then thereby sort of shutting down the opportunity for any kind of persuasion or budging on the other side. And so I really am following here the work of Adrienne Maree Brown, who's a major influence in my thinking. Adrienne Maree Brown's work in a book that she calls Emergent Strategy. She's recently published a lot more stuff. She talks about the criticality of what would happen if we shifted our priorities to being in relation. When I used to be a professor, I used to think my job is to arm my students with the best arguments so they can go out and change all those minds, right? That was what I thought my job was. And then I started realizing that this division is part of our problem. We're not getting anywhere on climate because of the division, right? Among other reasons, but that's part of an obvious source of despair for me anyway. I really thought to myself, gosh, this has some insight too. What if we were more in relation, we prioritize relationship as the slow thing that has to build before any of these other things can happen? Well, we curtail relationship in the name of urgency in the climate movement all the time. So just as an example of how I'm kind of going against the grain on that. I just want to focus a little bit on Hack the Story. I don't know what's happening here with my slides, sorry about that, but this particular story, I'm going to hone in on this a little bit. Hack the Story. And again, my slide, sorry about that. I'm thinking here of the great work by the eco-Buddhist sort of activist. She's now, I consider her an elder, Joanna Macy. She's written a beautiful book called Coming Back to Life. She founded and teaches people to do work called The Work That Reconnects, if you're ever interested in sort of doing more of this experiential teaching around this. She talks about a phenomenon that she writes in all her books called the 3 stories of now. And she basically, her argument is, depending on what story you're living in, what story you're telling yourself, this is a very kind of Buddhist insight, like what story am I telling myself? You will then behave in ways that reinforce that story. It's kind of like confirmation bias, right? So, for example, the story of what she calls the Great Unraveling is described here as, just what you'd imagine: disasters, collapse of all these systems. The climate itself is unraveling, the 6th great extinction, this thing that I like to call the litany trope. Most scientists walk into a room to talk about climate change and basically want to shake everyone's shoulders and say, here's how bad it is. Let me list all the things that are so bad. And it's not that those things are not true, but it comes from an assumption of what's called the information deficit myth, that if we just fill all those empty vessels of lack of information of all these people out there with how horrible it is, the more, the better, right? The more things on the list, the more likely they'll get irate and change things. That somehow that's going to kick off this, sequence of events that will solve the problem. And it turns out this is not true. So the Great Unraveling story, which most climate educators, most people who talk about climate participate in, turns out to be a sort of self-fulfilling prophecy. Why is that? Well, first of all, because of something psychologists call the negativity bias, which you probably are familiar with. This makes us subconsciously give more psychological significance to negative experiences and stories than positive ones, even if they're of the same intensity, right? Or the same reality. So this brain is looking over here at the bad. Things are definitely not good today when there's all this good piling up over here. So the negativity bias is a reptilian residual thing from our evolution. It helps us survive. There's some real purpose to it, to focus and scan the horizon for the thing that's the greatest threat. But of course, it's overdeveloped for a world where we're not getting attacked by saber-toothed tigers necessarily, although many of us have more risk perception heightened based on what our relative vulnerability is. But this notion that the story about climate is, what we're consuming, we think of the stories about climate to be truth, right? That's those scientists being true about climate. But our negativity bias also only focuses on those, and it also makes more of those come out, right? So this is where the media actually feeds our negativity bias and we feed the negativity bias in media by demanding those things, by putting our eyeballs on those things. Well, what is that? What is the effect of this on, what is the effect of our negativity bias on our climate action? What is the effect of this on our climate action? Well, the major effect that psychologists have talked about is something called pseudo-inefficacy. And this is a great word. I was like, yes, that's what's going on with my students. And I think that's what's going on with everybody. They use this scientific experiment. Peter Singer talked about this in the 70s about the child in the pond scenario, and they extrapolated it out and did a little bit more work on it. These conservation psychologists in this great book who reported on this in this book. And they basically said, if you're walking past a child drowning in a pond, you're very likely to try to save that child because the positive feelings of saving the child are really strong. You know, they outweigh the negative feelings of not saving the child. If you walk past many children drowning in a pond, you are less likely to even try to save one, because the negative feelings of not being able to save them all outweighs the positive feelings of saving even one. So obviously no children were harmed in this experiment, but think about the implications of this for climate, right? If we think the problem is really big, and it is, it's big. But if we frame it as big, we're constantly thinking this is too big to stop, too big to do anything about, too inevitable, long litany of problems, right? We are less likely to even try. And it's no wonder students aren't even coming to class. It's no wonder, right? Give up. There doesn't seem to be anything. So the pseudo-inefficacy effect, this notion of pseudo-inefficacy, I don't feel like I have any power to fix the situation, and so I'm not going to do anything about it. And the pseudo, of course, is this notion that's not true. We do have that. We do have that power. So how does this work? Our negativity bias kind of feeds the story of the great unraveling, which feeds our sense of pseudo-inefficacy and psychic numbing and empathic distress, which are other words you can look up, but I bet you can guess what those are, which actually results in inaction. So this is how this self-fulfilling prophecy unfolds. So yeah, is climate anxiety good for the planet? We could say in some ways that it is, right? It activates people. But over the long term, with that chronic stress aspect and the negativity bias aspect, it actually makes us turn off to action. And lots of people are thinking about this. So what are the kind of key points of hacking the story? Over 80% of climate stories are told in the negative frame. Our own negativity bias demands this supply, right? We put our eyeballs on those stories, so more of those stories come out. This lethal cocktail of both negativity bias of our brains, being met by the negativity bias in media, and the mutual perfect storm where we also just only look at that stuff, so we're repeating all these feedback loops, has us living in a story of apocalypse. No wonder we can't imagine a post-fossil fuel society, and we can imagine the apocalypse more. It's what psychologists call the availability heuristic, right? Psychological effects of this are to shut down and give up, of course. I mean, it's perfectly reasonable. I would do that too. Positive stories of solutions are essential for our existential capacity to engage in climate action, but they never make the news, right? Never make the news. To truly pay attention to reality, don't just read the climate news, ask what else is true, and fiercely seek and disseminate stories of solutions so that you and others can stay energized. And I mean, you know, we're not just consuming stories, we're also perpetuating, making stories, every single activity that we do on social media, what we share, what we spread around. Are we just participating in this negativity bias feedback cycle and actually depleting people's energy to deal with climate change when we participate like that? We sometimes feel like it's a performance of our wokeness, right? Performance of our sense of attachment to the news, and we're somehow being, you know, good citizens. But often it can actually have this byproduct. Avoid these faulty story elements. Just, you know, as you see them, know that they're story elements. They're not necessarily about reality. Inevitability, all humans as the antagonist, turning the victims into the culprits, as people are doing when they shoot people on the border, right? And this learned powerlessness, learned helplessness, that we think, oh, we don't have any power to do anything, so we can't do anything. And auditing our attention and checking our story is really helpful here. So in my given day, what are the stories I'm consuming? What is the ecosystem of the kind of emotional life I'm creating for myself? And again, we don't come back for more when we feel this way. We don't keep engaged, right? So the long-term depletion of living in a story of the apocalypse, of the great unraveling, is that we can't keep building the capacity to do what's required of us. So let's stick more carrot, right? Our brains are pleasure-seeking machines. So we ought to deploy that effectively in the stuff that we care about. And if we can stay in our range of resilience, we know that this is true. So cultivating emotions that build our capacity for long-term engagement, pleasure, desire, relationships, celebration, etc. This is, of course, ranges across different cultures and, whatever. It's not always these emotions, but the ones that keep us wanting to come back for more, whatever they are. And use these sticks of guilt and fear and anxiety sparingly where we can, right? So it always depends on the context. There's always exceptions, right? But you can see where I'm going with this. So what should we do about all this? What does the planet need from us if our anxiety is not serving it? Always, sometimes it is. I'm always careful to attenuate that. So I think I promised in the title a toolkit. So here's my toolkit list. And really, the toolkit is about exploring your answers to these questions in the breakthrough inquiry column here. So the tool is to build the capacity of your mind and body for long-term engagement. And what is the breakthrough question that can help you do that, right? So this is where I feel like, if you got your journal out and you actually wrote your deep thoughts of answers to these questions, you might break through with something, and you get strategic questioning, maybe help you think differently about this. Again, you can do this all in your seat, right? This is critical thinking stuff, right? I know that doesn't appeal to people who might fetishize kind of action, as it's commonly known, but as a person who is very much completely believe in the power of thought and ideas to shape the world, I hope that I can convince you that these things do shape the world. What would it take to shift your energy from scarcity to abundance? The second one, mindfulness of our emotions so that we know how to be our most skillful selves. Again, right there in that range of resilience. What does your distress point to? How is capitalism showing up through you? What makes you feel like you have and are enough? What does satisfaction feel like? Can you celebrate your abundance more? There's some ways of thinking about that question. More critical connection, less critical mass. Be less right and more in relation. Again, Adrienne Marie Brown's ideas here. She says, that's her language, think more about depth than breadth, right? Community trust and collaboration are the medicine for both social and ecological ailments. What would your work look like if it valued relationships more than anything else? Hack the story, reframe the problem and the solutions, and pay attention to your attention. Okay, so I just messed up something. Hang on. Sorry about that. My goodness, what have I done here? Sorry, I'll move something out of the way. I'm trying to see my own screen so I can share with you. What stories are you consuming, creating, living in, and asking others to live in? And what else is true, right? When I get totally bogged down in my negativity bias and I've just had too much time looking at the news or looking around me, I have to say, what else is true? That's the thing that gets me out of that, right? Oh yeah, there's all this beauty. There's all these things I love still alive and thriving. What do I do to nurture them? Healing the world with the radical imagination. So again, to combat this notion that we can't even imagine ourselves in a post-fossil fuel society, what would we desire about the future? Can we focus less on the stuff that needs to change, all the barriers, and more on the stuff that we want to grow? It's a very nuanced difference. But again, this is Adrienne Marie Brown's idea. There's stuff that we know we love, that we want to grow. How do we build that? Rather than look at the huge mound, the Sisyphean task of tackling all of the things that are terrible. Resist urgency, again, kind of going against the grain. Relationships with the planet and each other are the medicine, but they take time. What would it take to slow down enough to prioritize them over productivity and the scale or pace of so-called impact? Yeah, people are really too impatient usually to think about relationship. And they think that's not going to save the planet. right? But if you read the work of folks like Robin Wall Kimmerer or Kyle Powers White, you'll see that the actual root cause of the climate crisis is this rupturing of relationship, especially with the more than human world. Accept paradoxes as more true than binary myths. And this is a little bit woo-woo, I know, but this is where I'm at right now, right? That there's a lot of both and in all this stuff. I think that a lot of people, sorry about that, I was going to show you those Venn diagrams. So let me go back. So there's a lot of, I'll show that screen if you all want to see it again, but these are the vent diagrams. Vent diagrams are a phenomenon coming out of an activist who's written a piece in a fabulous book called Beyond Survival. And I just want to end on this slide to leave you with some vent diagrams around both and, right? Of course, you know, the thing most people in the college level at the developmental stage in the prefrontal cortex are not actually quite ready to think about gray area, but I invite you to. I'm sure you all can do it, that we can be with what is and also know that everything needs to change, right? The climate action that we just encountered at this historic scale is we should be celebrating it and also feeling grief and rage around all the sacrifice zones and problems that are happening. So just some Venn diagrams to give you a sense of the value of thinking about this both and world that we're living in. It gives us a sense of compassion and open door for the way that other people are feeling about climate change too. Not everybody is right there, and there's good reason for it, right? And I want to just end on Robin Wall Kimmerer's quote, even a wounded world is feeding us, even a wounded world holds us, giving us moments of wonder and joy. I choose joy over despair, not because I have my head in the sand, but because joy is what the earth gives me daily, and I must return the gift. And thank you so much. I'm done. I hope that I'm going to stop to share it, unless we can go back if folks need to see any of those slides, I can share them. So thank you, everybody.
And we want to open up for questions. So if anybody here in the live audience has questions, just raise your hand and come around with the microphone to make sure everyone hears it. Any of our friends that are joining us online, if you want to just type your question to the chat box, and we can voice that. So let's open it up.
Hi, I'm an elementary educator, and I guess I was just wondering to hear a little bit more about, I think your name was Ellen Kelsey's work about the age appropriateness, how we discussed the climate with kiddos and things like that. Is there, can you just tell me a little bit more about her work and what?
Yeah. Yeah, there are a couple of resources I would direct you to. One is Heather Price out of North Seattle College has produced a whole set of age-appropriate resources around climate on her website, which I believe is called Talk Climate or Climate Talk. So if you look up Heather Price Climate Talk, you'll get there. And she's done a really good job of collecting those in an age-appropriate way. The Climate Psychology Alliance of North America, the CPA as they're known as, also has a fantastic set of resources, including webinars and all kinds of stuff on climate anxiety and age-appropriate, teaching. So I strongly recommend that set of resources. They've really compiled something very useful there. Ellen Kelsey's work is also really thinking about this stuff. Her book is a fantastic book. She only talks about this particular topic a little bit in there, and because we're collaborators, I've heard her talk about this in other spaces. But her book is called Hope Matters. And she really thinks that teaching the climate crisis is like, we go through everybody's syllabi all the time for things like representation and trauma triggers and, accessibility guidelines, but nobody ever goes through them and talk and sort of thinks about sensitivity around climate information. And her argument is we ought to, we ought to. If you're going to integrate these ideas, now that the vast majority of people in this world are or will be experiencing climate trauma, it is remiss and unethical to talk about these things in ways that are not informed with basic child development knowledge. So Ellen Kelsey has that. Leslie Davenport has also recently written a book that's a little bit meant for a little bit older called All the Feelings Under the Sun. So she's written a book that was designed for that age. There's a couple of very good books. One is just come out called something like Parenting in the Climate Crisis, Parenting Through the Climate Crisis, which is probably just as good for teachers as it is for parents. So I'd recommend that too. And the sort of move within climate education to think about the emotional development of young people as they're encountering this information is happening. So there's communities of people who are really thinking about this. And I recommend, you won't take long before you find your people to think about this with. And the K through 12 is not my people. My college people are my people. So I often say, oh, go talk to Leslie or go talk to Ellen or go talk to, the many people who are thinking about the K through 12 emotional, social emotional learning happens in the young ages, from as early as preschool now. And so what happens if you layer in climate social emotional learning into the, instead of just having climate over here and social emotional learning over there, bring them together more intelligently. But yes, it's Ellen Kelsey's work, and she has all kinds of resources on her website. Ellen is spelled E-L-I-N, and Kelsey is K-E-L-S-E-Y. She's pretty cool.
Thanks. I have a question, but first just wanted to highlight that one of the regional read agenda items, October 19th, is climate anxiety, kids, teens, and their caregivers. So yeah, so we'll be talking about it locally with the therapists.
Okay.
And thank you for the wonderful talk, lots of great resources and ideas. I am helping to try to find a book to get our community talking about climate change. Agree with your statement that it's easier to imagine an apocalypse than a post-fossil fuel society. Do you have anything that has helped you imagine that post-fossil fuel society?
Yeah, that's such a great question. So there is so much generative work in this world of what might be called the radical imagination. A lot of this work is happening in some, but not all, cli-fi or climate fiction. So speculative fiction is a beautiful place for this work to be happening. The work of Afrofuturism, indigenous futurism, there's all kinds of both theory and texts that are coming out of these what might be considered marginal from the oppressed, right, from the grassroots, that have been staking out the imagination about the future for some time, right, for some time, because their existential existence has been at stake for longer than people who have been extracting and settling and colonizing the resources, and are only now coming around to thinking, oh, maybe actually my future is not going to be livable, right? So this notion of the future not being very livable and participating in an apocalyptic fetish is oddly sort of a strange privilege, right? That we haven't actually created in my culture, in my sort of white European Western culture, that I have not created traditions of thinking about better futures for my ancestors who might come after me, is pretty astonishing, right? So yeah, there's a lot of fabulous stuff happening out there. It's not necessarily coming from my people, my culture. But the just transition movement is one example of people who are doing that. The just transition movement is all about articulating what's possible and making it happen. So public banks, all kinds of crazy stuff. That's, where all of this stuff is probably going to be headed at some point. It's a great question. Thank you.
I guess I've got a question about your students and how they receive your course. At the end, like, have you noticed that there's a change in their outlook about climate change and just the future in general after taking your course and grappling with some of those ideas?
Yeah.
And is there a particular activity or idea that really gets to them, right, and helps change their mind?
Yeah, I'm loath to generalize my students, and it's there's definitely wins and losses there, so I don't want to ignore the places where I really didn't quite get it right, and wish I had done it differently. But the general answer to your question is absolutely. The thing is that the power, there's two things. The power of just creating the container for people to talk about how they're feeling about what's happening is extraordinary. You, as a professor, I almost don't have to do anything. It all goes from there. And then they decide what has to fill up the rest of the syllabus, what they're going to do with it. It's extremely empowering. And it's not just about witnessing, it's about validating and motivating and clarifying vision, and finding other people who feel the same way, and then pairing up or grouping up and collectively doing something together. So there's that. There's an element of just simply the space of being able to share those things has a healing effect. So yes, just that. And what I do is I try to de-emphasize content and emphasize process over content. So there's just a lot of time built into my teaching for processing, and I just don't fill up a lot of my syllabus like I used to. I think of it as sort of a crutch, right? Like content is this crutch, like just let the students do what they're gonna do, and determine it from there. Secondly, the thing that very much is critical for my students, I think, is that if we treat the classroom as a laboratory for the world, then everything that comes up, their fights, their emotional journeys or roller coasters, their even the microaggressions that happen, this is how the world we desire is going to be built, right? We're going to have to do all of this to build it. So the classroom as a laboratory is extremely effective. And if you frame it that way throughout, and at the end, what you have is, look at that, all those skills that we built. You can see skills in a different light. You see them in other qualities that are not, like I said, hearts and minds are a technology. We're not building solar panels in this class, although that's an important skill, obviously, for some people. Thank God there's somebody else on my campus who teaches how to do that. So I have to do that. I don't know how to do that. Right. But the hearts and minds part, right? Like, let's hone these skills. Even Donella Meadows, the economist, said that she's so famous for coming up with these 9 leverage points in a system, right? Any big system you want to change, here are the 9 leverage points for all of them, right? She sort of comes up with this universal theory of change. She says the number one, even above economic incentives for change, even above political policy around change, all these things that we really, really want, right, is mindset out of which these systems grow. Right. So yeah, I see full changes of mindset, because critical thinking, emotions, we can all do that in the classroom together. We don't have to go and storm the Capitol, or, take down a pipeline, or all of the things I know my students would like to do. We can just sit in the classroom and practice the skills, yeah, it's not something far in the future of their careers. It's right here, right now. There are other answers to that question, but yeah, the more I've turned to it, the more I feel that effect. Yeah, it's also, I would say that it walks a line, and I want to temper what I've said with knowing that for female faculty, and especially for female faculty of color, opening the door to students' emotional needs and thinking, oh, I can help your emotional needs is uncompensated labor, right? There's nothing in the institution that compensates that labor. And so my argument is, if this, students are going to be in crisis, and emotions are how students learn, so why don't you just do it all in the classroom? And therefore it's not cultural taxation, it's not labor taxation, it's actually the work you are explicitly there to do. And that changes a bit if you have that latitude as a professor.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
Other questions?
Hi, Sarah. Margo Higgins. Nice to see you. We met in Alaska.
Oh,
Criticism conference and worked together.
yeah.
Really nice. Thank you for a wonderful talk. I'm interested in this idea about pseudo inefficiency or in
Efficacy.
inefficacy. Sorry.
Took me a while. Took me a while. Yeah.
And how we can guide students through that process or through remedying that process. One thing we do in our department, a number of us in the environmental studies department here, is ask students to do an eco challenge. I don't know if you're familiar with the institute that organizes those, and I think they are very impactful for students. We let them choose what they want to do, so those actions can range from turning off the lights to giving up meat for 3 weeks. But it seems too that it's challenging to get them to think more systematically when it comes to efficacy. And I wonder if you have any thoughts on that or any particular exercises that you do. I would love to see your syllabus.
Yeah, that's what,
yeah, and
that is,
particular activities to kind of.
I struggle. Sorry, sorry.
Just connect these little actions to a bigger picture that also seems accessible.
Yeah, right. Okay, so I'm going to give like a meta answer to that because that's my comfort zone. And then I will also make some confessions about action. So my first response to this, and I was so chewing on this that I actually wrote an article on this, so you can find it on KCET if you actually want to read my full thoughts on that, which goes to this point about the scale of the problem being framed as too big and us as individuals being framed too small. And notice how I'm saying being framed and not just saying the problem's too big and we're too small, but that's the story we're living in, right? And by saying that, I'm saying we can live in a different story. And as Buddhists will say, all stories are wrong, but some are more useful than others, right? Like there's, the idea that we're going to figure out truth and reality, right? Let's dispense of that. Which of these stories is going to be the most useful for the stuff I care about? If I care about the climate, which story do I need to live in? And let's do what I need to do to live in that story. So when it comes to the scale question, which is what causes a pseudo inefficacy, whatever you can do to have students deconstruct the problem to be smaller. Timothy Morton famously calls climate change something that he calls a hyperobject. And the hyperobject notion is that it's so big and so so vast, and it's like a whack-a-mole coming up in many different places, or another metaphor is like all the different parts of the elephant. You can't even figure out what it is. It feels so big. There's all these different things. It's dispersed across time and space in ways that seem unrelated to each other. And when something becomes a hyperobject, who can possibly tackle that? It's impossible. So the more we can frame climate change not as a hyperobject, as something that's right outside your window that requires some local action, right? And climate change, interestingly enough, climate change, even as a phenomenon, cannot in fact be perceived by humans, because of the temporal scale over which it happens. So in fact, all we ever will do is experience climate change by its proxies, not by the hyper object of climate change. We'll never experience the hyper object. We'll only experience it in these little whack-a-mole places that it comes up. And depending on who we are and what community we're in, or geographically where we are, what race we are, et cetera, we're going to experience that in one place one way and another place another way. So really, we probably shouldn't even be calling climate change. If we really wanted to combat pseudo inefficacy, we should be calling it whatever is right in front of us, right? So, we know we want to tell the story that is related to climate change. It's interesting, wherever I go and I ask people, how does climate change touch you in your life? I ask this question oftentimes, and no one ever says the pandemic. I find that so strange. The pandemic this is the kind of stuff that we're going to get with climate change. All the IPCC reports tell us that we're going to have greater infectious diseases. We're going to have a public health crisis on our hands. It's just going to exacerbate all the inequalities that exist in the medical system, blah, 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 right? And no one ever talks. So the imagination of even thinking about what are the ways that we're experiencing climate change is not even there. So thinking about, let's talk about climate change in unique communities, in with specificity around how climate change is being experienced there to make climate change smaller, basically, really simply put, right? Oh yeah, there's a problem in my community. Well, I can put some energy towards trying to address that. That's a scale I can work at, I'll be useful there because efficacy is required for happiness, turns out. The definition of depression is not feeling you have the control over the conditions of your life. So yeah, climate change, let's make it really small. And then secondly, this is part of the meta answer too, make ourselves bigger, right? And that I don't mean physically bigger, but I mean, we think of ourselves because of the soup of American society we live in, regardless of what our ancestors are, we often think of ourselves as operating as individuals, but we're not operating as individuals. Capitalism would like us to think we're operating as individuals. That ecological footprint that BP produced would like us to think we're operating as individuals, but we're actually part of the groundswell, what Adrian Morel calls a murmuration. Paul Hawken calls it the blessed unrest, right? There's all kinds, the great turning is what Joanna Macy calls it, right? That's the story of the great turning that we're in. And if we see ourselves in concert with all of these other people, it amplifies all of our actions. It not just amplifies it because other people are doing it, but because it's contagious and ripples out. And in fact, people who study this stuff show, and I mentioned earlier, like what's the psychology behind behavior change? The number one thing that makes people change their behavior around climate action is seeing other people do it that they trust. So when we do something, no matter how small it might feel, other people around us are seeing that and are going to do it. It amplifies by rippling out and kind of that effect. So we're bigger than we think we are. And every little bit the climate apocalypse is not going to happen like overnight and then we're off the cliff. And so the inevitability thing about, forget it, I shouldn't even try. On the contrary, it's a slow moving thing that's going to, if we stick a pinky out and try to slow it down and put some brakes on, that's going to be a little bit less hard that we hit the tree at the bottom of the hill, a little less harm that's going to be done. So every tiny little bit is actually equating to less harm happening. So this notion of those my individual actions matter, totally irrelevant in that context. So this reframing is everything to me. Reframing is everything. Now the concession, I know it's a long answer, such a good question. The concession is that I'm not a big fan of like just action, right? So I used to do an assignment called action in place. And I really now I don't do it anymore because I hate the assumptions of what counts as an action. And for my students, to answer your question, I don't like to circumscribe what happens. So when one of my students did for their action in place assignment that they were going to do 30 days of mindfulness, and that included things like brushing their teeth with their non-dominant hand, I almost gave her an F, right? Like I was like, that's not an action. How's that going to save the planet? Please. But it was a real window for me. Sometimes that's the action, right? And so I'm really loath now that I've done this deeper, almost spiritual dive into inaction as action even, to circumscribe what counts as having an effect for students, and I do think that the inner work of exploring what that could be for different students, at what scale and what spheres, what they have passion for, what they have skills for, what they already have built-in networks for, all of that stuff is the fun of it. What they actually do after that is just, icing on the cake. But I don't know if that helps. Yeah, I'm a little bit like action. There's lots of ways. There's so many people who can teach you about different actions, but I feel like the inner work to explore which action is the most appropriate for a person is more exciting to me. And this idea of kind of reframing things as you're actually bigger than you think, and the climate problem is actually smaller than you think. That's helpful. That's empowering to me. Sorry for the long-winded answer. It's a good question, obviously.
Questions? Audience. Is there anything coming in online? Oh, great.
I know as a speaker, I always hate those questions that aren't really questions, so my apologies. But I'm trying to put together everything that you said, and I work in many different roles, but the one I'm thinking of right now is our church environmental group. And so we have been trying to scale our action. We've been trying to be positive, right? Instead of saying, don't use such and such, you can do this. We've been trying to balance, giving some options for those that are at the stage of time in nature versus those that need to do those, what some people think are the ultimate actions or whatever, right? Direct actions. So from what I'm hearing, I'm thinking like as a community, and so I guess I want to know if I'm interpreting this correctly. So say our group was going to, they want to address plastics, and they're going to be like, we're just going to look at straws. We're going to, look at one plastic that we can have impact on. So would the place to start would be building those relationships in the community with the businesses, and then building relationships with other churches, and everyone going, this is doable, and then all coming together as a group, and that would create that ripple effect. Am I?
Yeah, I think you're picking up on the main gist of some of the things that I've been saying, which is the relationships are what create the conditions for the scaling out. Yeah, right. And the art of relationship is challenging, as you know, right? So that's why it takes time. That's why it's slower than most people would like for climate action. Yeah, but in some ways we have all the time in the world. We're going to be doing this forever. So.
Ashley, on that note, well, and then just in respect to your time, I know you've got another talk to give in a half an hour somewhere else. So you're a very busy person. Sarah, thank you so much for taking time to spend with us and share your wisdom and your knowledge and your learning. It's certainly opened my eyes. So if we could just give her a round of applause.